Hello everyone, greetings from the Servant of Nero, AJ here, with a somewhat different take on the historiography of the time known as the Orgoth occupation, and the subsequent rebellion against the Orgoth. As previously noted, House of Dice has a very detailed and well-researched piece on this era that spans those 800 years, link in the description, so I won't tread worn ground, at least not here or now. More than that, most histories in world about this era are told from a strictly human perspective, with little reference to other races that inhabit the titular Iron Kingdoms, namely the Cholkin. While this piece won't make any sort of redress as concerns Cholkin history, it still highlights the depth of the setting, but also that there is still a great deal that can be explored, as there was a lot more to this period than just what the human nations went through. The Orgoth invasion was, perhaps, at least when the invaders were dominant, the longest-lasting period of stagnation for humanity in Western Immoren, counterbalanced by the most noteworthy era of continuous innovation during the rebellion. It was, no doubt, the darkest age of mankind of recent millennia, second only to the coming of the Infernals, for it is easy to forget that we are but 400 years past their expulsion, while their presence on Immore's shores lasted for almost twice that duration. To the chroniclers of the Iron Kingdoms, though, it is a matter of intense study, as well as debate, emotion, and memory, enough that they often recall this era without reference to other peoples and regions of Immoren, if with some justification. And while humanity, and to an extent those they shared their lands with under Orgoth rule, seek to balance their simultaneous desires to recall with clarity and completely forget, their neighbours throughout Immoren look upon this time with perhaps different eyes and thoughts. Within Western Immoren and beyond the borders of those lands that would come to be called the Iron Kingdoms, three major areas remained untouched and unbothered by Orgoth tyrants. To the southwest, the Shard Islands and the core of the nightmare empire of Cryx. To the north, the strongholds of the Rule. And to the east, the unwelcoming forests of Ios and the Mistbow. After abortive efforts against the first two of these realms, the Orgoth satisfied themselves with overlordship of those nations of mankind, disdaining the choice to conquer the lands of the necromancers, the dwarves, and the elves. It is well known that Toruk took flight but once during this time, and such an occasion resulted in the utter devastation of an Orgoth invasion fleet that sunk a Styx's force when it mobilized to attack Skell, while before the Arms Deep at Horgenhold, a great Orgoth host was dashed against that great fortress's walls, though at great cost to the dwarves. To this day, we can but speculate as to why the Orgoth chose not to press their advances into Immoren against those that are not human. The most likely reason we can suggest is that at the time the decision was made, they had suffered sufficient losses at the hands of the undead in the south and the dwarves in the north, that they had too few military resources to both fully subjugate the human realms and plan further expeditions against these far-flung enemies that could be. We know not of Orgoth politics in their homelands far to the west, but thankfully they conspired to keep the fell invaders within the realms of mankind. It is likely that any desire the overlords here had to expand their reach further into Immoren was quelled firstly by a sense of pragmatism, secondly by orders from their masters across the ocean, and finally by the resurgent peoples of the Iron Alliance and its antecedents. In rule, the dwarves possessed no great friendship with the humans that had, over the past several thousand years, extended their reach to the southern borders of the 7 counties. Indeed, their fortresses existed for good reason, and in eras past they served their purpose in keeping such powers as the Lords of Mord from becoming over-ambitious. Consequently, they viewed the Orgoth as merely another arrogant group among humans, albeit of more distant origin. Relations with the Cardic Empire and the Kingdom of Renaer were cool at best, and thus the dwarves saw no reason to march their warriors to aid their southern neighbours. Until this time, few dwarven armies had ever ventured south with martial intent, and the reasons to set out were far from compelling. And with the dragon Scafang causing havoc in the north, the rural folk had more pressing problems to deal with. I understand that some corners of humanity continue to harbour great prejudice against the dwarves for this, foolish though such sentiments are. The situation was similar in the Dragonfather's domain, for after the loss of their fleet, the Orgoth were wary of Lord Toruk, as one should be. But where the rule folk continued about their normal life and kept their borders strong, the Cryxians did that and more. They watched and observed until such time was appropriate. When the rebellion was well underway and the Orgoth were as much as defeated on the mainland, the Lich Lords and their undead legions were unleashed on Draegr in the north of Galgast, the first, greatest, and eventually the last Orgoth stronghold in Immoren, and the largest one not built on Immore's mainland. While the Orgoth, in enacting the Great Scourge, sought to bring down the Lich Lords with them, The necromancers of the Nightmare Empire have a certain way with things, whether living or dead, and they learned, and inherited, one might say, much from the ruins of that once looming fortress. With their failures against the Dwarves and the Cryxians, the Orgoth did not so much as organise an attack against Ios, and we can only estimate at whether they had any such intentions at all. However, there was one isolated encounter between Orgoth and elven kind, when an expedition discovered and attacked the Castle of Keys, a relic and ruin dating back to the Warlord era, built in a patch of unclaimed territory south of Ios, overlooking the westernmost reaches of the Bloodstone Desert. Fleeing from its creator, the dragon Pyromalfic took refuge beneath the ruins and came to prey upon the mourning Iosans after the Divine Court had departed. A small sect of blighted cultists thus formed around that dragon, and many died during the attack by the Orgoth, the rest surviving only because the dragon himself rose to drive away the invaders. Pyromalfic was gravely wounded in the struggle, though, and was forced to slumber after the battle was won to recover, as too did those that remained of his worshippers. With this third encounter against the dragon of Immoren, the Orgoth would not trouble them or their allies and followers again. Their second encounter with the dragon, after the defeat by Toruk, is a matter of some debate, as they fought and defeated what appears to be a lesser dragon near Vroggen, and held it to Thank in a temple nearby, only for a new dragon to form around the Thank and see it destroy the city. In light of their defeat at the Castle of the Keys, it is likely they considered dragons more trouble than they were worth, though whether this factored into their policy on elven kind we cannot say. But even without this seemingly minimal presence of the Orgoth at Ios's borders, the elves would have their own misfortunes. The people of Darsail had long since left, and a state of melancholy had settled over the nation in the aftermath of the departure of the Divine Court. Suddenly, though, in 3826, or 140 BR by human reckoning, the priesthoods of all the fanes except that of Scyrah were stricken by a mania, though even the priests of the goddess of spring suffered, if a great deal less so than their fellows from the other fanes. It would transpire that the priesthood of Nisor also escaped this fate, but it mattered not to the fane of Scyrah, for her faithful on Caen were left alone to calm the madness that gripped their peers. Through the streets of all the great cities of Ios, priests descended into psychosis, falling to catatonia, or lashing out at anyone and anything that they encountered. As those least affected, the priests of Scyrah did their best to alleviate the suffering of the maddened. At the time, it was unknown why they suffered so, but upon the coming of the hermit, he alleged that it was the deal brokered between human god and infernal that led to the loss of the Divine Court as they journeyed back to the Veld. While we on Caen cannot confirm that this was indeed the fate of the gods of Ios, the hermit's words ring true when coupled with the testimony from those few priests who regained their sanity. When a sense of stability returned to the fanes, the Divine Court came to be known as the Vanished. Shortly thereafter, the first soulless births occurred among Iosans. Though rare at first, the curse of the soulless children would become more and more common with each successive generation. Even Scyrah's return, a little over a hecyion and a half after the Rivening, brought little respite. Her reappearance was muted, and first-hand Iosan accounts of when she appeared before Sheer are filled with confusion and a strange lack of awareness of the gravity of her retirement to the fane of Lasir, where she has remained ever since. It was a little after this time that the embassy from the Nis came. Several generations of life in the northern peaks in much colder climes, persisting in conditions that some Iosans would call abject deprivation, had changed the children of Darsail greatly, and the elves that came to the Gate of Mists were different, too different from those they entreated for entry to the homeland of their ancestors. But the Iosans were grieving and unreasonable, and turned their cousins away, treating them no differently from any other unwelcome foreigner. These emissaries begged to be allowed to speak with the priests of Scyrah and the consulate court, but to no avail. The guardians at the gate saw only exiles, followers of a pariah who willingly abandoned their fellow Iosans when there was no compelling reason to do so. We look back upon this with no small regret, for this rejection caused the Nis to consider themselves as children of Ios no more. They would do so with bitterness and resentment that was a reflection of the Iosans that turned them away. To the best that can be accounted for, Nisor returned shortly after Scyrah took her rest within her sister's fane, bringing the last great artifacts of the Divine Court with him. It was under his orders that ambassadors from the Winter Elves were dispatched on the perilous journey to Ios. Like his sister, Nisor was weakened, and also took his rest in his divine vault of ice, his warrior priests keeping vigil just as the Fane Knights did and do for Scyrah. Further to the east, the regular turmoil that was the goings-on within the Scor Realms was seemingly put on hold when the greatest natural disaster in Scor history caused a years-long upheaval. While nowhere near as devastating as the Cataclysm, it nevertheless dealt a blow to the standing of many ruling houses. This event was the eruption of Mount Carrick, the volcano far to the south of Halark. The explosion could be clearly heard from that city, and while it was unscathed, ash and soot rained down for weeks without pause in the aftermath, a period that became to be known as the Months of Darkness. Cities and communities closer to the volcano were not so fortunate, and thousands died from starvation in the ensuing months and years of struggles. Many fled to Halark or other major cities far from Carrick to escape the deprivation. The entire region would suffer from famine that lasted for several years. Conflicts between the Scor houses remained intermittent, but none would escalate to the scale of conflict that marked wars of preceding eras. This concludes what we are certain of during this period, but one other people's, though some are understandably reluctant to consider them a people, one other people's activities bear some consideration. The Cephalyx had not been idle in the years after their retreat underground after the Cataclysm. Though quite when they made what passes for societal and technological advancements, we cannot say with any surety. What happened with relation to the Orgoth occupation can at least be partially resolved with what records from other sources exist. It seems as though they had been migrating northwest over the millennia, unable to fully dissociate themselves from their human heritage. For their society would ever be built on a hierarchy of thrall-like judges under Cephalyx rule and control, most of which were humans throughout the lands of the Iron Kingdoms. But with the arrival of the Orgoth, their source of slave labour greatly diminished, and their raids on human settlements became a rare occurrence. On occasion, Orgoth and Cephalyx came into conflict when the former discovered the latter's hives, or a subterranean slaving expedition grew too ambitious, though none can rightly call either victorious, considering the fundamental differences in the Cephalyx way of thinking. But they appeared to adapt, as encounters with them, whether by the Western Immoren or Orgoth that we could tell, almost stopped entirely. They re-emerged as the Orgoth occupation became lax, with the tyrant overlords allowing the conquered a measure of autonomy, and then even more so when the occupation gave way to the rebellion. Emboldened by limited successes at first, Cephalyx slaving raids grew more common once more. From patterns in hive behaviour and interaction with the populations on the surface that have been collated, it seems as though partway through the rebellion years, the Cephalyx made a breakthrough. As far as we can deduce, this breakthrough resulted in functional immortality, but it was a technology that only the senior echelons of each hive were allowed to take advantage of. Given what we know of their power, though, this restriction is of little comfort to the common villager of the Iron Kingdoms. However, the years following the Orgoth occupation would bring little respite to the peoples of Immoren, for as is the wont of the Immorenes, one enemy would always be replaced by another, even if the new enemy was once a neighbour or ally.